Hello and welcome to You Should Hear This, a podcast for the everyday association professional. I'm Chris Beeman, your host. Doesn't it feel like associations often seem behind the curve when it comes to technological advancements? Would you agree that there's a significant lack of knowledge about the impact of Google Analytics 4 on and for associations? On today's episode with our guest, we are going to dig into why and how associations can find value in first-party data, why this is so incredibly important, and what they can be doing now to set themselves up for a big advantage in the future. So let's get to know our guest today, Taulbee Jackson. Taulbee is a senior strategist for Willow Marketing. He provides research, planning, analysis, and strategic guidance for Willow clients with a focus on customer journey orchestration, content strategy, audience development, customer data, personalization, automation, media, analytics, and data-driven marketing. Taulbee is also an assistant lecturer at the School of Journalism and Strategic Communication in the College of Communication, Information, and Media at Ball State University. He's provided content strategy and audience development consultation for organizations like Walmart, the U.S. Department of Defense, 3 Super Bowls, Finish Line, GoDaddy, and more than 50 other national and global brands. He's an author, consultant, founder of 2 of his own companies that have been successful in the digital marketing and customer experience industry. Welcome, Taulbee.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me this morning. It's a pleasure
Of course. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So before we dive in, is there anything about yourself you'd like to tell listeners that we didn't cover in your bio?
No, I think you did a great job of a quick review of how I got to Willow. And I'm super excited to be working with this organization and, more importantly, the clients that they focus on, which are almost exclusively in the association and member-based organization space. There's a lot of organizations out there doing good work that really benefits society, and I'm really honored to have been brought on to the team here and to be able to work with those kinds of clients. So,
For sure. Yeah, we appreciate that. So some of our listeners might be hearing the term first-party data. I've got my air quotes there. First-party data for the first time today. Can you define this a little bit for us?
sure. So the simple definition of first-party data is data that an organization owns. So for an association or a member-based organization, this is your member database. And in a lot of cases, that data is probably in various stages of completion or thoroughness, depending on how you store it and how often you pay attention to it. But the context for first-party data is in relation to something called third-party data. And third-party data is data that, strangely enough, a third party would own and control. And this has been the central tenet of digital advertising for a long time, particularly in programmatic. When we talk about third-party data in relation to first-party data, third-party data is data that an organization might gather, say, from your browser behaviors. In applied terms, if you think about when you visit a website and you get the little pop-up that says, allow cookies, when we all kind of mash that button and move on with our days. What's happening in that scenario is you're giving that organization permission to capture, in some cases, behavioral data about what you're doing in your browser. And that data is often used to aggregate audiences that you can target. An example of this might be a member-based organization that's looking to grow their membership, right? So one way to target new members would be traditionally demographically, right? How old are they? What industries might they be in? What is their household income? What is their geography? With third-party data, you can get into a lot more specifics around where they've spent their time online and all kinds of behavioral information that's a little bit scary from a consumer perspective, but also really compelling from a marketing standpoint. So there's that fine line to balance there, but you're able to leverage your first party data in a lot of cases by taking your audience or your member database and, for instance, saying, show me all the people that look like this database. And through third party data, you can aggregate an audience that shares the same behaviors, the same interests, the same demographics, the same firmographics. And it's really pretty interesting stuff. And I think one of the questions you have on here is related to GDPR, which we're going to get to here in a minute. But what's happened over time is as people have started gathering this third party data, it's raised a lot of questions about privacy. And in response to that, a lot of governments have started to legislate how we gather that data as marketers. And so this has caused kind of a ripple effect, right? So there's been so much reliance on third party data in the past that we're starting to see legislation like GDPR, CCPA, which we'll get into. And that has been a big driver for things like Google Analytics 4 and how we market to people. And so the evolution of all of this, kind of the end game, is that the importance of first party data has really started to increase and will continue to increase as more regulations start to come out around how people can gather and manage third party data from a privacy perspective. So, the long answer to that question, it's a very complex topic, but I think from an association perspective, from a member based organization perspective, this is a segment of business or a segment of organizations that really are well positioned to take advantage of that.
Absolutely. And I have so many questions now as a result of that. No, that's excellent. I think from a consumer standpoint, I'm just curious, what really am I signing away when I mash that accept cookies button? What what am I giving an organization or a company?
That's a great question, and the answer is it's complicated. So it really depends on each individual website and what kinds of information they gather. A lot of this again is based around cookie oriented information gathering. So in some cases, it could be as simple as you're giving this company permission to use cookies that are functional in nature that might make the website work better and don't gather any personal information. In some cases, those cookies could be gathering everything from your household income to the location of your cell phone to your email address. There's all kinds of really interesting pieces of data that can be gathered through this methodology. The good news is there's generally an option from a consumer perspective to manage what you share and what you don't for websites that are
Sure.
compliant with this anyway. Uh,
And I think we'll touch on that a little bit too, because so many associations have members, individual members, willingly providing them with this first party data, right? Like when I sign up for a membership in my association, I'll give them my first name, last name, probably multiple email addresses, my date of birth, all of these household income, possibly. They for sure know my industry. So there's a lot of information associations have on members. But before we get into that, you mentioned GDPR. Whatever happened to that? I know there was a lot of noise about GDPR for several years, and it still comes up here and there, but that's still a thing, right?
it is very much a thing. And what has happened to it is the concept behind it has really started to expand into other states, even at the federal level here in the US. There's been a lot of consideration about how this legislation should and could work. California, in particular, has already moved forward with similar legislation called CCPA. So, just to give listeners a sense of what this alphabet soup stuff means, GDPR is it's legislation that was passed in the EU called the General Data Protection Regulation. And what that is about is what we've been talking about, protecting consumers' information from the organizations that are gathering it and giving people the right as a person to manage that data, right? And that's a little bit different than how this stuff has been handled in the past. And the way that the EU has approached it really has set a precedent for what we're likely to see in the US. So as of right now, we have CCPA, which is the California Consumer Protection Act. That is probably the most popular legislation here in the US so far in terms of how far along it is. But they're not the only state that has legislation either in place or in progress ranging from legislation that's just been introduced to actual passed signed legislation. And we see that in Oregon, we see it in Utah, Colorado, Texas, Tennessee, Indiana, where I'm from, Virginia. A lot of these states have already started to follow California's lead and legislate at the state level, which from a marketing perspective introduces some really interesting challenges to make sure that you're compliant state by state is a steep hill to climb. But at this point, generally, most of the technology and most of the policies are built to be compliant with GDPR and with CCPA. This has been the model for other states. There may be some minor differences from one state to the next, but I think the intent of this legislation has been around protecting consumers and giving them rights to their own data. And I
So,
can
and that's
share with you on this as well.
sure. That's really helpful. I guess that was I was gonna try and oversimplify, but for the most part, these regulations are designed to protect us as consumers, right?
That's right.
But it is introducing some interesting challenges for marketers because they're having access to less and less of that third-party data that we talked about. Is that also fair and true?
Yeah, that's one of the challenges is that when people do have more of an overt opportunity to manage their own data and how they share it, more people are going to exercise that. And so it makes it more difficult for marketers and advertisers to gather that third party data we were talking about. And the industry has responded to this in a lot of really positive ways. Google, in particular, with their changes around how they manage analytics and what data they gather and how that's displayed is a good example with GA4 moving to more of a model that is not so much based on third party cookies, but other means of gathering data. Apple has been a leader in this space, particularly around cell phone privacy and some of the features that they've added to iOS and their devices to protect your data and give you more rights around how you share it, what you share, who you share it with. From an industry standpoint, um, they're trying to stay out ahead of being over legislated or being over regulated. But I think that push pull between consumer demand for privacy, government actually recognizing that there's a need for this, and the industry also acknowledging that there might be a better way and that there's a way to accomplish what advertisers and marketers need to accomplish and still be fair to consumers and still treat their data with respect is where we're at today. We see all of this as a moving target, but it seems to be coming together in a pretty positive way from my perspective.
That's good to hear from you. I think that there is, from the consumer standpoint, or maybe it's just me, I think there's some skepticism in these big tech and data companies that a lot of what they're doing is self-serving. It's monopolizing their access to the data, but it doesn't actually protect our data. But anyway, that's a tangent we probably shouldn't get into today. But I guess thinking about associations, this is kind of going to be a twofold question, really.
Mhm.
From your perspective, what is the most significant opportunity for associations when it comes to this first party data? And then also, do any of those align with any opportunity to generate non-dues revenue?
Great questions. And the first part of that I think is really interesting in this space, in that associations are not necessarily like most businesses, right? They're not necessarily a commercial enterprise. They exist for the most part to serve their members. So they've already out of the gate structurally from a DNA perspective they've got to focus on their customer that is unusual compared to a lot of uh, more commercial enterprises, right? So they're there to serve their members. And the focus in a lot of these organizations is just that. They're not necessarily beholden to Wall Street. They're not trying to make their quarter. They're trying to serve their members and obviously grow their membership base and generate more dues, revenue, and all of those things. But it's all in the service of members, which makes it a pretty unique type of an organization. And also, it means that they're probably more fluent and more focused on first party data and understanding their members than you might see from a lot of more commercial organizations. So, to me, a member based organization has some really unique advantages as this space continues to evolve, in that they're already very experienced and probably very active with their data, with their member data in particular. And they're able to serve those folks in a way that is a little bit different because it's not completely reliant on profitability. Now, that being said, there are lots of ways that this can be leveraged, right? Any organization obviously has to generate revenue, it has people to pay, it has overheads, it costs money to provide services to members, and we have to continue to grow our member revenue, right, to serve those members. I think first party data and that focus on the membership base can deliver that in some interesting ways. And when you start to think about how to make better use of that data rather than just having it sit in a CRM, and maybe we send an email out to those people every once in a while, really getting smart about appending information to that first party data, like personal preference data and interest level data, and being able to serve content and resources to that member base on a much more personalized level. I think that offers a lot of opportunity for increased revenue. One of the clients that we work with, we went through this with in terms of really refocusing their understanding of the role that they play for their members, less as a member based organization and more reimagining it almost as a publisher relationship, where they're almost, this member organization is positioning itself as a newsroom where they're looking at the media preferences of their memberships and delivering very relevant, high impact content and resources based on more personalized preferences, right? So it's really taking what member organizations are already good at and doubling down on it and really extending that relationship to deliver an even more engaging customer experience.
And when you talk about, I think this is a fascinating concept because, again, as members give us this data, but I'm also thinking about the opportunity to, you mentioned appending data to what we currently have. And to clarify, you're talking both data that a member or customer is going to self-report about their interest, but are you also talking about using third-party data to append that to these records as well?
But yeah, I think it's all of the above. With the member data that we're gathering and the permissions associated to that, we're able to start to gather more behavioral data from them on a first party basis. I think that's the difference between someone, for instance, that maybe goes to an e-commerce site and buys something as a guest, and that's the end of the relationship, right? We don't have permission to gather any more data about that person. Whereas with a member based organization, they're volunteering a lot of information already. And if you manage your permissions the right way, you can start to track beyond what they voluntarily give you, right? Understanding, for instance, how they're using your association's website, what content's interesting to them, what they're doing after they leave or before they get there, how they're using their mobile devices. All of that data is available on a first party basis when you've got an established relationship and you've got permission to gather that kind of information. In that scenario, you wouldn't have to go get third party data to figure that stuff out. You'd be able to gather that and manage that on your own with the right permissions. Then in addition to that, in terms of future member growth, there is still opportunity, I think, in the third party data space to go find audiences that are similar. We call them lookalike audiences in programmatic, and to proactively go out and use the data that you're gathering on a first party basis to find more of those members using third party data. So it works together, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Big topic coming up, Google Analytics 4. But first, just because we have an expert here on the podcast, I want to ask you, you mentioned the mobile device behavior. So many of us will be in conversation at dinner or with a friend and we'll talk about something. Oh, I just saw this set of pool chairs that I'm thinking about ordering, and then we'll get an ad for it. So can you confirm for us, Taulbee, that our conversations lead to advertising? Is that true or false?
I think it's possible, and again, I think it depends on what permissions you've given the various services that you use. In my house, I have a couple of different smart speakers, the little Apple smart speakers.
Sure.
Um, I don't know for sure because I didn't read all of
Yeah,
the
right.
all of the legalese around what I'm giving that smart speaker permission to do. But I've experienced that before. And one of the interesting things about the audio kind of version of this is almost all of our devices now have speech as a user interface, right? Hey Siri, hey Google, whatever it might be. Oh, I just turned my phone on. Sorry. Sorry, Siri.
I'm afraid to say the word Alexa because I don't know she'll start listening. But I
Yeah.
think she's already listening is the thing.
Yeah. And again, I think you could dig into the permissions for each of those devices and probably figure that out and probably manage those permissions. But on top of that, the use of third party data, and particularly in combination recently with AI, but even before that was a big thing, like a lot of companies have gotten good enough at predictive analytics to know what you're going to want before you want it. There's a really famous example of this, and I wish I had the case study handy, and this was several years ago where a woman shopping at Target. I'm trying to make sure I get this all. I think she got a coupon for diapers or formula or something like this, and was really surprised because she didn't have kids. And it turns out late that she later found out she was actually pregnant at the time. And Target was able to forecast the fact that she would want those particular products based on her past behavior and kind of knew that she was pregnant before she did. It's not always that those kinds of insights or personalized recommendations are not always a function of audio. Sometimes it's just based on your past behavior. You're doing things that exhibit that you are going to be in market for a certain product or whatever it might be.
Sure.
But yeah, the level of detail that a lot of really sophisticated marketing organizations are able to deliver around forecasting preferences and forecasting purchases and things like that is fascinating
Yeah.
and terrifying.
And I'm interested. I the timeliness of this. Of course, things like this happen to us all the time. But my husband and I close on a new home in just a couple of weeks, and I'm so interested to see what all begins to pop up in my inbox and on my phone, on Facebook, from Wayfair, from Target, from all these places that I assume are going to find out soon that I have just bought a new home. I don't know how they know it, but they're going to know, right?
Sure.
So,
That's another kind of a form of third party data is access to publicly available information. And that can be all kinds of things. I realized based on some work that I'm doing at my house that my acreage at my home is publicly available information, and my property lines and all of this other stuff is all posted to a database that anyone can access. And those kinds of databases are fair game for marketers and are used regularly as a third party data source.
wow.
Yeah,
This is all, it's just blowing my mind. So let's shift gears to, we've talked a little bit about Google Analytics 4. Over the summer, there was a lot of panic around migration. There was a lot of talk of what that meant. Could you just, the biggest question I have is what really is the big deal with it? And could you boil down what that panic was all about for us?
sure. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of what was driving this transition to GA4 had to do with privacy and how Google was gathering data. So Universal Analytics relied much more on third party data, particularly cookie data, and provided a lot more information that in a lot of cases wasn't built around privacy controls. And so that was a big part of Google's motivation. Another big part of it was to help people rethink analytics to be more about specific actions, right? So the big focus in GA is around events, and this can give you a much more granular understanding of how people are using your website. So, like a good example of this would be in Universal Analytics, you might see a metric like page views that would tell you, hey, a person viewed this page. In GA4, you can get to event level data that describes not just a page view, but this person viewed this page, then they scrolled, then they viewed a certain part of the page, then they scrolled again. So a lot of on-page behaviors that happen can be tracked as events and associated to conversions. So, excuse me, it's a much more kind of outcome-oriented approach to analytics in general than what we saw in UA, in that it encourages you to define events that are important to you as a business and that are reflective of your business goals in a much more direct way than I think we saw in Universal Analytics. You could, of course, do all of that in UA, but it wasn't necessarily as geared towards driving specific actions and measuring specific actions at a very granular level like GA4 is built around.
What are some things that associations should be prioritizing as a result of this migration? And I guess along those same lines, what are some things that what are some things we could be doing to level up our marketing and/or digital presence in general?
Sure. I think in relation to this recent migration to GA4, our clients, actually, we went through and migrated earlier this year. And one of the things that we found that I think is worth mentioning is the amount of data that Google Analytics 4 will actually store, which I think I'm not even going to say for sure because I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's not a lot. I want to say it's something like a year and 6 months of data. And so from a historical perspective, that's the default position. And we encourage all of our clients to also add an instance of BigQuery to store historical data. So over time in Universal Analytics, you could look backwards 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years and really understand baselines and trends and have that time-based information to help guide you. In GA4, you're really not going to have as far to look back, right? So transitioning your Universal Analytics data to a place where you can access it easily, like a BigQuery, and regularly backing up your data to that data source so that you've got that backwards look, I think is a really smart move for people that are implementing this or that are still in transition or maybe have recently transitioned and didn't realize that they're going to lose some of that ability. That's one of the first things I would look at. I think another thing in terms of leveling up marketing and digital presence to consider is understanding how to move beyond just user provided data and starting to gather some of this more behavioral information around your users and their preferences and understanding how to serve those preferences and using that from a business intelligence standpoint. Another common recommendation we have for a lot of our clients is the implementation of a customer data platform. So this is fairly inexpensive technology that allows you to work alongside a CRM or an association management platform that's going to gather some of that data that we've been talking about that people provide and associate Facebook data and shopping data and data from these users across their web experience. So you have not just what they've chosen to provide, but what they've given you permission to gather that can really provide some really unique insights and some really interesting ways to market to people. Segment is one of the tools that we use for that. And it works like a big connector. So you can connect data sources like Facebook or Twitter or Google Analytics to kind of one side of this box. And on the other side, you can connect different methods of communication, like your email service provider or a text messaging service or push notifications to a mobile app and really use all of that data you're gathering from all of those platforms alongside what you already have to identify and build different audiences and communicate to those audiences in very personalized, specific ways. And then the third thing I would mention in relation to GA4, in really the idea of customer data management is understanding your business objectives and how those manifest themselves in GA4. If your goal is to increase awareness or change a perception or sell a membership book, whatever it might be, what is the associated conversion point in Google Analytics and how are we measuring that? So, how is that represented online and how do we ensure that the digital experience around that culminates in an action that is a measurable conversion so we can understand how we're actually accomplishing our business goals or if we're accomplishing our business goals. That's a really powerful way to use GA4 and one that I don't think is very common in terms of how analytics are being used in a lot of associations.
And I'm going to assume that there probably aren't a lot of case studies out there from big companies like Walmart, Finish Line on how they're doing it because they wouldn't want competitors to know, right? Or are there actual use cases and case studies out there for associations to at least glean insights from?
In terms of like customer data platforms, I know Segment has several available, and there are multiple tools in that space that work with much larger, more sophisticated organizations that have really been delivering some interesting outcomes. I'm sure there's some case studies out there. I couldn't put my finger on the fly here, but I know that those exist, and particularly in the e-commerce space, which tends to be a little bit out ahead of the rest of marketing from a digital perspective because it's so easy to understand success, right? Did someone complete a transaction or not? That's the business. And when you look at the companies that are out on the bleeding edge, it's the Amazons of the world that are in that e-com space and really are starting to understand how to use customer data to personalize recommendations, right? That's probably the best example of how a company can use a customer data platform. Obviously, Amazon probably has their own home built solution for this, but how they're able to leverage that data to deliver the right recommendations from a product standpoint can be applied to content as well. So you get to this place where you're able to, using customer data, get the right content to the right person at the right time. Not everyone's ready to become a member at the moment, right? So what kind of nurturing do they need prior to that? How are they moving through the customer life cycle and what does that look like? And how do we automate the delivery of content and messaging to motivate them to move through that life cycle? How do we create our own flywheel and approach it from that perspective? That's been something that we've really focused on a lot here at Willow, is looking at customer journey and understanding what each of those phases look like, and not just building a messaging solution, but automating and continuing to optimize against each one of those phases and really drive people not just through new membership, but also with existing membership. How do we turn those members into advocates? How do we use the audience of our audience to generate more audience? All of that at this point, using customer data, can be automated and optimized in a very similar manner to what on Amazon. It's a pretty exciting time. And I think that associations are really well positioned to take advantage of that approach.
I love that you say it's a pretty exciting time because I'm sitting here thinking that it's overwhelming and daunting. And so we're gonna I imagine there are people on both sides of the camp who are listening in today. So I just want to let everyone know we are going to get to a question at the very end of how people can be in touch with Taulbee if they want to chat, learn more, identify solutions. But before we do that, Toby, we've talked a lot about the knowns today, the things that we know to be true about first party data, what we anticipate coming down in terms of regulations and trends. But are there any unknowns in your world right now? Anything that you're paying really close attention to see how it's going to shake out?
Oh, absolutely. It's so obvious, but AI is going to impact our industry and already is impacting our industry in some really compelling and interesting ways and some really scary ways. And it's a big question mark for everyone. And that's something that we've developed a position on and actually delivered a point of view paper to our clients last year on AI and how we use it, how we don't use it in producing materials for our clients, but also on the membership association side, it could be a real interesting um, tool for organizations with limited resources, which is almost every association, right? Every association would love to have a 25-person in-house marketing and content team to serve their members. But I know a lot of associations are very limited in their resources. And so being able to leverage AI to do some things that would have taken more time or would have taken a different skill set. And we're starting to see that normalize in the creative space and the messaging and advertising space. We use AI for media buying to optimize media buys pretty regularly. There's there's so many potential applications for it and so many open questions about everything from what does it mean for resource management to what does it mean from a moral and ethical perspective to what does it mean from a copyright standpoint? You
Yeah,
know,
I've heard intellectual property is one of the biggest concerns, especially for associations. And in my work, I've worked with academic organizations. And so this conversation of intellectual property and just uh, general moral, like, as you said, moral and ethical concerns of how we use it is really coming into play.
yeah, it's it, and I don't think anyone has the answer. I think there are lots of opinions out there on various, extremes. But the approach that we're taking is to continue to be lifelong learners and at least know what the possibilities are and to develop a firm point of view about what lines we cross and what lines we don't and the guardrails around how we use this technology. I think it's important that an agency partner or any organization really spend some time thinking about that and reflecting on what their approach is going to be. And actually, in addition to my work at Willow, I teach at a university, as you mentioned, I think in my bio, and that's something I've been talking to students about a lot was how we use AI in the classroom to learn. It's pretty easy to type a prompt into Chat GPT and generate a 5,000 word article. Uh,
And it will get it down to the 5,000th word. It will do exactly as you asked it to.
yeah, and it's getting better and better at those things. The approach that I've taken with a lot of my students is to encourage them to use the tools, but make sure that ask permission of the professor first before you use it. And when you turn in your work, turn in your original work, your prompt alongside what the AI generated and think about it like a partner, like a person that you're working with. Give it the credit that it earns. And I think that understanding how to use the tools and what is possible and what is not and what it all means, it's going to require some hands-on work, right? If there's anyone listening to this podcast that hasn't logged into a Chat GPT or some other AI tool just to try it, I would strongly encourage you doing that. I think it will be eye-opening and you'll start to see all kinds of possibilities about the upside as well as the downside to this kind of technology.
And I think it's a big lesson that we probably all have to learn in life, and that is be open to being wrong. As you pointed out, there's a lot of people right now with a lot of big questions about this, and no one really has what we feel are like the right answers. And so I think it's a life lesson in all things related to tech, I assume, and that is be open to learning, be open to being wrong, and at the end of the day, just give it a try. See what you can explore.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that we say all the time at Willow is it's all a science experiment. You know, we're experts in what we do, but we don't always have the answer. And it's okay to experiment and fail and learn. That's part of optimization. That's part of how you continuously improve is you try new things and really treat it like a data-driven science experiment. So that's a really kind of fundamental core thing for us at the agency is taking that approach to clients and helping them leverage new technology in as low a risk way as possible. We always talk about the concept of aim small, miss small, run lots of tests, figure out what works and then scale it. But yeah, I think it's the same deal with AI where it's find some ways where you can apply it in small, low risk areas and small, low risk ways. And when you find something that does work and that you're comfortable with it as an organization and all of those things, scale it. There's lots of opportunity there. And it'll be interesting to see how that space develops over time.
Sure. I can't tell you how much I appreciate our conversation today. And I know we covered quite a few topics. We covered first party data, Google Analytics for artificial intelligence. And I anticipate, as I do, people who are listening in will have questions and would like to reach out and possibly even work with you at some point. So if listeners would like to connect with you, where can they find you or how can they be in touch?
Sure, sure. My email address is taulbeejackson@willowmarketing.com. And I've got that weird first name, so I'll spell it out. Taulbee Jackson@willowmarketing.com. Email is probably the best way to reach out. I'm also on Twitter, LinkedIn, all of the social platforms. If you just search my name, you'll pop up, or I'll pop up, and you'll find me that way. So happy to respond on any of those platforms as well. The agency website is willowmarketing.com. There's obviously a contact form there that you can use. And I'd love to talk to anyone who's interested in this stuff. I love talking about how to help associations that are doing good work for society and helping their members. And it's really something that motivates me to get up every morning and go to work is the people that I get to help are doing such good things out in the world. And that's it's a great way to live. I'm loving it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the incredible conversation today and also for your work in helping associations navigate this really complex space and world. So I really appreciate it, Taulbee.
Likewise, Chris, thank you for having me on and appreciate the time and the conversation. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. We hope you enjoyed this episode of You Should Hear This. If you have any questions that you'd answered or future topics you'd like us to explore, please send us an email at info@isae.org. Thank you for your leadership of your associations, and I'll see you over on the next episode of You Should Hear This.